How many times have you clicked on a watercolor painting tutorial for beginners and the artist begins by wetting down the entire paper? I know, it seems like a perfectly logical first step, but if you're anything like me, or how I used to be anyway, this is the point where you begin to wonder if you have what it takes to tackle the upcoming project, and maybe even shy away from the tutorial altogether. I had a real fear of wet on wet painting. The loss of control was certainly part of the fear, but even more so, I was afraid of feeling rushed. As soon as the water covered the paper, an invisible countdown began in my mind. Every second that passed, I was that much closer to being stuck with a damp, unworkable mess. In this video, I'll discuss a couple options I've heard from other artists on how to work around this problem, but mainly, I want to focus on what worked for me, something I discovered through trial and error that truly helped me get past this hurdle. And the best thing about this method is you can totally customize it to fit your own skill, your level of comfortability, and any tutorials that you want to follow. And don't worry, you'll eventually learn to trust the wet on wet process, and you'll be able to look at this initial layer, the ugly stage, without judgment. So, let's go ahead and get started. I'll place this wet on wet one aside for now. So take a look at my sketch. See how I've created different sections? There are 7 separate portions of this page. And for our first step, we are only going to worry about one of them. So what I'm doing now is I'm wetting down the top section. Go over it a few times if you need to. Be sure to get plenty of water, but not so much that you're flowing out of bounds. I'll give the water a moment to begin to soak into the paper, and then I'm going to start adding my sky. So at this point, I'm not concerned with the mountains or the field. I have a single task: paint the sky. And because I am still technically painting wet on wet, I have the ability to drop in additional colors, letting them mix and flow together. I can take my time and not feel rushed at all. Using a paper towel, I'm adding clouds, some puffy ones and some long wispy ones. Once you're happy with your sky, you have a decision to make. Do you want to work on the next layer down, knowing that you'll be working right next to the still wet sky, or do you want to give yourself a buffer? For this first example, let's go with a buffer. We'll skip the mountains and move on to this row of bushes. Just like before, I'm wetting down a single section, without concern for any other areas at this time. I'm starting with a covering of light green, and I'll be dropping in some blues and darker greens. These are both granulating paints, so you can already start to see some of the beautiful textures. And once again, I'm taking my time, working entirely stress-free right now. I don't have to worry about loss of control or feeling overwhelmed or rushed. Although the video is sped up, so I guess it probably looks like I'm going a little faster than I really am. All right, I think I'll stop there. Now it looks like the sky is almost dry, but not quite, so I'm going to head down to the field next. For these next few sections, let's see what happens when we paint right next to the still wet areas. As I wet down this section, take a look at where my brush comes in contact with the wet paint. Do you see that touch of blue-green leaking into the neighboring section? This is where it gets really fun. I can choose whether I want to keep my distance ever so slightly, or just give the neighbor a little kiss. Okay, that was a strange way to put it. I'll have to come up with a better way to describe that. It really is cool, though, how you can make the decision to let the colors bleed into the surrounding areas or keep the colors apart. And on to the next one. I'm going with red. And I think with these rows of crops, I'd like to let them mingle, so I'm not going to be overly careful about keeping my rows precise. I'd prefer a bit of mixing. See how soft the lines appear where we let let the wet come in contact with the other wet area? I'm just tripping over my words today. So next we're on to a row of green. I believe this is under sea green, which I use a lot in landscapes, even though it's technically not under the sea, but that's okay. And I'm realizing now that I didn't drop in any additional colors or values in the yellow and red, but that's all right. We can still add some additional details in depth in layer 2. And speaking of layers, as I finish up this first one, let's actually talk a little bit more about layers of a watercolor painting. Of course, there are unlimited possibilities when it comes to painting, but what seems to make the most sense, in my opinion, is breaking the process down into 3 main steps, or layers. I've seen many artists cover this 3-step approach, so I'm certainly not trying to claim it as my own. But basically, the first layer is most often done using the wet-on-wet method. This is a chance to lay down the lightest values. Layer 2, which takes place after the first layer is completely dry, is the time to apply mid-tone values. And the third layer, also done on dry paper, is reserved for the darkest values, those final details. Now, with this section by section technique that I'm showing you today, we're just breaking down the first layer into bite-sized pieces. You'll notice that I've moved on to the last remaining section, the mountains. And because the sky is now dry, my mountains didn't wind up bleeding away, swallowed up by the heavens. They have a lot more structure than they normally would. In fact, I'm just realizing that this would have been the perfect opportunity to leave the tips of our mountains white for the effect of snowy peaks. Well, that was a missed opportunity right there. As we finish up the mountains, layer 1 is done. And I'm going to move on to layer 2, adding mid-tone values and a bit more structure to the painting. Now, I do realize that this approach might not provide you with the ultra soft feel that wet on wet is known for, but it's a baby step. It's a tool to help you get comfortable with the process, a way of surrendering control in smaller doses. So before I move on to the final example, I do want to mention 2 wet on wet tips that I've heard from others. These tips might help you if you often feel like you don't have enough time before your paper dries. The first tip is wetting the back side of the paper, then flipping it over and thoroughly wetting the front. Wait for the water to soak slightly. Then, when the surface starts to look sheen, it's a good indicator that it's time to add your paint. I've heard some artists say that this provides you with quite a bit of extra time to work wet and wet. And I would love to say that it worked for me, but the extra water just added to that feeling of having no control. Plus, I really enjoy taping down my paper and creating that clean border around the edges. So this first one was a no-go for me, but it might be worth a try for you. The second tip, I've been told that you can actually use a mister and spray your paper throughout layer 1, keeping it wet along the way. Well, you probably know where this is going, as I'm not exactly known for things going my way straight out of the gate. When I tried this, I wound up with unwanted cauliflowers or blooms where the water pushed the pigment away. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I was adding the water too late, once it had already started venturing from wet to damp. But as a complete beginner, I didn't realize this. I didn't truly understand the difference between wet and damp just by looking at my paper. I just knew that my painting was not behaving in the same manner as the artist in the video. If you decide to give it a try, let me know if you have better luck than I did. On to the final practice session. This time around, I'll be starting with separate sections like before, but I'd like to move from one section to the next, each time letting the new section touch the still wet previous section. So let's have some fun with this and really play around with the neighboring colors. Remember to wet down only the area you're currently working on. Lack of time no longer feels like a problem when you have a much smaller section to work on. And I'll throw in some clouds because they're just so much fun. And wetting down the mountain next, this section will fully come in contact with the wet sky. And I'm letting my brush graze gently against the sky, pooling into the mountains in small streams of color. Bringing in a shade of gray, I'll let those two colors mix. They can dance on the paper, doing what they want. And take note of the sky where I intentionally bring the gray of the mountains into the blue, letting it float upwards. You know, I just thought of one more wet on wet tip that actually did work for me, but I don't always remember to implement it. And that tip is to use a large enough brush during the first layer, one that will not only hold plenty of paint, but also cover more surface area, allowing you to work faster. And that's actually a great tip because I know that I often find myself using a small brush and then struggling to make it work. For these bushes, I'm coming all the way up to the border of the mountains, allowing the sections to come together and bleed into one another. I'm going to add a lake for this last section. So today, we've gone over 2 ways to use this section by section method. Working next to a dry area for more control and structure, that's the first way, and working next to a wet area to add blending and bleeding in an intentional manner. You can see that I'm moving on to layer 2 of the painting at this point. And as I work on this layer, let's talk about ways to use this technique while following tutorials. At the very beginning of the video, if the artist begins by wetting the whole page, they are likely planning to use the wet on wet approach for the entire first layer. If this makes you nervous, don't pick up that paintbrush just yet. Watch the first portion of the video, creating a basic color guide and taking notes. If you're intending to use the exact same paint colors as the artist, see if they have a color list in the description. Many tutorials do. This will help so you can have your colors ready to go. And once you can see that the artist has put a single layer of paint on the surface, take a screenshot. It should look something like this. Remember that wet on wet painting we started at the intro? All soft lines with no structure at this point. See if you can break the painting down into more manageable sections. Complete your first layer using the section by section approach that we did today, and then once your surface is dry, simply continue along with the rest of the tutorial. I'm sure that before long, you'll be ready to take on that full page, painting wet on wet with confidence. But until then, don't be discouraged. It's perfectly acceptable to take an alternate approach while you build your skills. Thank you for watching.